Well, good morning. Welcome to all of you. This is the annual report on our retirement system, which is of great interest to all the members of the organization. Our speakers today are Bob Conlon, who's the Secretary of the Wisconsin Department of Employee Trust Funds. He's been Secretary since January 2012 and is responsible for overseeing the provision of employee benefit plans covering 620,000 participants and approximately $96 billion in assets. He has over 25 years experience as a public servant, including 11 years now at ETF. The other speaker this morning is Michael Williamson, who's the director of the State of Wisconsin Investment Board, SWIB, which handles our retirement money, invests it, and makes sure that we have enough money coming in to pay our pensions. He's been here since 2012. He's had over 40 years experience working in the public sector, and before here he spent 10 years as director of the North Carolina Retirement System, which is the 10th largest U.S. public retirement system, and was deputy director of the District of Columbia Retirement Board in Washington, D.C. He spent some considerable time here in Madison before he started doing all that stuff, and was advisor to Chancellor Shalala when she was here. So you probably remember him from the good old days. I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time introducing our speakers because you want to hear what they have to say. So I'll just tell you that first is going to be Bob Conlon, next is going to be Michael Williamson. They're going to give their talks, which should take just a little bit over an hour. Well, then we'll take a 10-minute break and then reconvene for questions after that. So, Bob.
Thank you, Millard. So, and thanks everybody for coming out. It's good to see so many familiar faces. How many are new? Is this first time? Anybody? Few people, first time? Okay, good. As Millard said, I'm Bob Conlon. I'm from the Department of Employee Trust Funds. I tend to wander around a little bit during my talks rather than stand there. Michael calls me a pacer. I prefer to think of it as a moving target. Wanted to also introduce Nancy Ketterhagen from our communications staff. Nancy will apparently be doing some live tweeting today from today's event. She assures me she will not be sparking a trade war or a third world war with her tweets. So as Millard said, we're going to try to get through some brief presentations, but the real point is to actually get to your questions at the end of this. So I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the things that are going on with the Wisconsin retirement system, talk a little bit about some of the stuff that's going on in the budget as well, investments, health of the system, some of the policy stuff, and then kind of give you an update on some of the initiatives we have going on at ETF that you may hear about or experience. So, health of the system. I think the good news, well, I know it's good news, is the WRS continues to be a very healthy retirement system, and that's something we can all be proud of. Unlike some of our perhaps friends to the south, we actually have money to pay the promised benefits that you all get every month, and that's a good thing. Now, I wanted to highlight a couple of things about this. You will see we have a funding method. That's what we use to set the contribution rates. That's the method that typically uses 5-year smoothing to spread the investment gains and losses over a little bit longer period of time. We wouldn't want to set annuity adjustments or contribution rates in a manner that causes them to jump all over the place. So that tends to be a little more stable method of reporting. This number right here, the market value of assets, we're still well funded under that, 98.2%. We refer to GASB. GASB, that's the Government Accounting Standards Board. It's one of our new four-letter words that we use all the time at ETF. But one of the things that GASB did is they implemented some new accounting standards for public pension systems. And what they wanted to do was kind of line everybody up so that everybody's using the same standards so that we could compare apples to apples. Well, of course, that still doesn't happen because there are different bells and whistles in each system that affect the funding. But that's one of the numbers that every pension system has to report these days. And unlike our funding methodology, it is not smoothed. So it's basically market value. It is going to go up and down based on how investments perform. So that number, that 98.2%, will be jumping all over the place for the next few years. Get used to it. Legislators are going to take a great deal of interest in it when it's below 100%. One of the messages we have for them, don't panic when it's below 100% because it'll be back up over 100%. And when it's up over 100%, don't take that money because it'll be back under 100%. So again, it's an accounting standard. It's something they try to impose on everybody so that everybody can kind of be compared together. But you're going to see some volatility in that. 98, I think we're probably up over $100 billion in assets total, WRS, both the core fund and the variable fund together. And again, we continue to be one of the larger public pension systems in the country and in the world. Last year, we paid about $4.5 billion in pension benefits to WRS retirees. Now, about 73 or so % of that $4.5 billion came from investment earnings over time. So when you hear stories about, oh, taxpayers pay all of these WRS benefits, no, a lot of it comes from, most of it comes from investment earnings. And that's one of the reasons why having a professional investment services available to us like SWIB is so important. Another interesting point of that, when we pay out $4.5 billion, where does that money go? So according to our records, about 86% of retirees manage to maintain some sort of residence in Wisconsin after they retire. So that's about $4.5 billion that comes right back into the Wisconsin economy that gets spent in our shopping centers, our grocery stores, our coffee shops, you name it. Department of Revenue, you pay taxes on it. It all comes right back into the Wisconsin economy, and that's a pretty huge thing. We have about 610,000 total members, active members, inactive members, and retirees, about 198,000 retirees or so. One of the things that the Wisconsin Legislative Audit Bureau tracks every year is kind of how well we do versus our peers, similar retirement systems. I don't know why they pick these, New York State and local, Oregon, Iowa, Ohio. These are the ones they follow, the ones they generally match us up to. But as you can see, we do pretty well against our peers in that space. Now, it's somewhat misleading. There are a lot more pension systems than just the 5 that are up there. But really, there's only about a handful of major public pension systems that are fully or nearly fully funded like Wisconsin is. The health of public pension systems nationally has been improving over the last several years. As we get past the Great Recession, more and more retirement systems are regaining a foothold on their solvency, on being able to pay benefits for the long term. Some of that is because systems have changed benefits for employees going forward, changed the liabilities. Some of it is because some of these systems have started getting more in terms of contributions coming in. And some of it is because the investment environment has changed considerably and improved since the Great Recession. So you still hear a lot of hand-wringing or see a lot of hand-wringing and hear a lot of gnashing of teeth in the national press and some local press about the dire state of public pensions. There are certainly public pension systems out there that have long-term problems. Don't throw the baby out with the bathwater, though. There are a lot more systems that are in the 70, 80, almost 90% funded status. And if I was 80% funded on my mortgage, I'd feel pretty happy right now. These are long-term liabilities. What you need is a plan to pay those off over the long term. And most public pension systems around the country have a plan to do that, and we're seeing improvements on that going forward. So I want to spend a few minutes just talking a little bit about investments and the investment environment and how that affects the WRS. Obviously, Michael's going to talk a little bit more about that. Some of you have seen the news, hopefully everybody has seen the news about the annuity adjustments that we apply this spring. Will show up on your May 1 check. For the core fund, the adjustment is 2%. And for the variable fund, the adjustment is 4%. So again, not terrible, not back in the high-flying days of the 90s, but still a pretty respectable adjustment going forward. Certainly beating what Social Security paid out this year and keeping ahead of inflation. So I think that's all a good thing. Under the green bar up here, you can see every year we try to take a little bit of a stab at what might be coming down the road in terms of future annuity adjustments. And what we do is we basically project out, if we assume we get a certain return next year or this year, what will the annuity adjustment be next spring at this time? And so you can see up here, if we hit 7.2% in 2017, which is our assumed rate of investment return for the system, if we hit that, we'll be paying an annuity adjustment somewhere 0.5% to 1%. Considerably lower than this year, but still on the positive side of things. The one thing you don't want to see is red when we're talking about these numbers. If we have a return somewhere in the 5% range, and that's about where the core fund is today as we speak, a little bit north of 5%, or right around 5%. If the year were to end with a 5% return, we would basically be talking about a 0% adjustment, which isn't really an adjustment, it's just 0%. To get to a negative adjustment, go to the bad old days that we had a few years ago, a 0% return in 2017. So in other words, if the year ends flat or worse, we might be looking at a negative adjustment next year. So that's what's coming down the road, and that's where we start getting into conversations about what the investment environment looks like. This year's returns for 2016 were pretty solid. Core fund had a return of 8.6%, and the variable fund had a return of about 10.6%. Pretty respectable returns in a tough investment environment. The chart on the right kind of tracks long-term history of investment returns. And this came from the Legislative Audit Bureau, one of the things that they show to the legislature regularly. Basically, over the very long term, 20, I think, years, they say it's 20 years even though they only show 10 years in their chart. But over 20 years, our investment return has been 7.2%, which is exactly consistent with our long-term expected rate of return. But you can see the trend in that line is steadily down and to the right. And that's a concern, I think, for a lot of people, that we're living in an age with very low interest rates. We're going to have very low investment returns over the future time period. One of the issues that often comes up when we talk with legislators is that 7.2% expected rate of return still realistic? And one response we have is it's going to be challenging, but it's not impossible to hit 7.2% these days. The question is, how much risk do you want to take in doing that? As you saw, we earned 8.6% this last year, so yes, it's definitely doable. The other response we generally have for that is the WRS has a system in place for determining whether those rates of return are still reasonable. In the WRS, every year, our actuaries do what they call a gain-loss analysis. And what the gain-loss analysis is, it's an analysis of the gains and losses. Actuaries aren't real creative people. But what they do is they basically look every year, how did our assumptions, how did what we think was going to happen in the system actually match up with what happened? And that includes demographic type things, you know, how many people died, which ones died, how much did we earn in terms of investments, who retired, how many people retired, did more people retire than we thought? They look every year to see how our assumptions matched up. And then what we do with that is we do, every 3 years, we roll those we roll those gain-loss analyses up into what they call a 3-year experience study. Again, very creative, titled. But that's when we take a harder look at, okay, now that we've got some experience under our belt, 3 years worth of experience, is it time to start making changes in those assumptions? Because the idea is you don't want to be changing assumptions every year because you're going to be jumping all over the place. You want to see how your assumptions hold up over a longer period of time. And so after 3 years, the actuaries pull all those individual gain-loss analyses together and really say, okay, have we learned anything over the last 3 years that should be informing our understanding of the system going forward? One of the things we often look at, or always look at in that, is the reasonableness of the expected rate of return. That's 7.2%. 2017 is the 3rd year in that 3-year cycle. So sometime in 2018, our actuaries will be coming back to us with that 3-year experience study, where they roll all those up and make recommendations on whether our assumptions that we use are still reasonable. Now, of course, assumptions aren't just about what happened. It's also about what we think is going to happen. And so the earnings assumption, the expected rate of return, is one of those that we have to kind of look in the rearview mirror, but we also have to look forward in terms of what we think is going to happen in the markets. And what I can tell you, based on working closely with SWIB and the actuaries and their investment experts, is that I think there's pretty good consensus that the next few years, it's going to be pretty tough to earn a good rate of return, something that might justify the 7.2%. But the 7.2% isn't a short-term rate of return, it's a long-term rate of return. So balancing that short-term view, what's going on in the current climate, with what we expect to earn over the very long term, that's the trick. And what we see today is over the long term, 7.2, excuse me, 7.2 is still probably a very reasonable number for a 20, 30-year time horizon. Maybe in the next 4, 5, 6 years, it's going to be a little tougher to hit that. So anyway, we will be getting asked questions about that, and I just wanted you guys to be aware that we do have a process. And part of my message when we do that is, you know, some folks feel like they have to insert themselves into the process and make changes for us. We have a process for that, and that's something that we continually remind people of. So keep your eye on that. So, policy. There's this thing called the biennial budget that gets introduced every 2 years. And it often contains a lot of policy initiatives. Some of them are related to spending, some of them not so much. When it comes to ETF in our programs, there are a couple of things specifically in the budget that I want to spend a little bit of time talking about, because there's two provisions. One is the domestic partners provision. And basically what they are proposing in the governor's budget is to, on a prospective basis, eliminate coverage for domestic partners under our benefit programs. And if you recall, a few years ago, the state made the decision to allow domestic partners to be covered as a dependent, just like a spouse, for health insurance and WRS and disability and all that other sort of thing. We then had some major shifts in how courts viewed the issue of same-sex marriage and allowing, now we basically are in a situation where we have marriage equality. And I think the intent behind this legislation is if people can get married now, there's no reason to have the domestic partner provisions in law anymore. It appears as though most of the domestic partners that are covered under the current law tend to be opposite-sex domestic partners. But that's one of the provisions that's in the law, that's in the biennial budget. We haven't heard a lot of talk about getting rid of that. There have been some tweaks proposed to it, but it doesn't seem like it's something that is challenging a lot of people to oppose it. So that's something that's on the horizon. The other thing is self-insurance. And if you have been following the press on this topic, and how many of you were here, I think back in February, Lisa Ellinger was out, okay. So Lisa's our Director of Health Policy. She's been front and center on the self-insurance thing, working with the Group Insurance Board. I'm not going to repeat everything she said. She is the one that knows 110% of what's going on there. But if you've been reading the press, it seems as though there doesn't seem to be a lot of support on the Joint Finance Committee for self-insurance and advancing self-insurance. So as a nonpartisan agency, I take a lot of pride in the fact that we are the one issue that we have brought both parties together on in opposition. So, the other piece of self-insurance, I mean, I think everybody here understands the concept, or at least what it would, potential effects it would have on the health insurance part of what we do. The way the governor put it in the budget, though, the projected savings from self-insurance are tied to a couple of things. One, it's tied to potential pay increases for faculty and staff at the UW system. And then two, increased funding for K-12 public education is tied to that funding. Now, while you have seen a lot of opposition to the self-insurance model, you haven't heard a lot of opposition to the funding pieces of that. People don't seem to be opposed to the idea of paying faculty more or giving more money to K-12. So if you take away self-insurance, but you want the savings from it, I was never very good at math, but it seems like something has to shift there. So before people get too giddy about the idea that, yay, self-insurance is dead, we have some examples of what has happened in the past when they have been looking for money. In two out of the last 6 years, I think, either the governor or the legislature has gone back to the Group Insurance Board and said, we want you to find savings. Where does that savings come from? It comes from generally employees paying more for their health insurance. Higher deductibles, higher premiums, higher out-of-pockets, you name it. When we were briefing the Joint Finance Committee on the self-insurance proposal during the agency budget briefings, which is where the agencies brief the budget committee, we were getting questions about why didn't you look at changing benefits? So I don't know how that's going to come out. If you didn't like self-insurance, that's fine, but I think there may be another shoe to drop on that issue coming down the road, and that may be a painful shoe for a lot of people. The Legislative Audit Committee. A few months ago, I think it was like towards the end of December and early January, the Legislative Audit Bureau issued a couple of standard reports on both ETF and SWIB. Now, Michael and I both know that in our business, auditors are a constant presence in our shop, and the Audit Bureau spends a lot of time auditing both SWIB and ETF. So these weren't special audits that come out, it's kind of part of the standard process. The Audit Bureau made a number of findings and recommendations in terms of ETFs. We had some accounting errors that they found. These errors were, in the grand scheme of things, they didn't have any effect on the account balance of the WRS. They weren't material, as they say in auditor speak. And they were fixed before any of our financial reports were released. Unfortunately, though, it kind of fit a pattern. We have not had the greatest attention to detail in some of our accounting practices at ETF, and I think it was annoying to the LAB, the Legislative Audit Bureau, and they called us out on it, which is fine. We need to correct that, and I've recently hired a new chief financial officer who I think is the person that's going to do that. We've already seen vast improvements in that. But one of the things that happens is when the Audit Bureau issues their little one-page summary of things, sometimes that's all that legislators read, and they don't read the detail behind things. And so we saw some legislators kind of shooting off letters to the editors about all the problems and that sort of thing without really understanding what was going on. So we responded to those things. We have those responses out on our website, and we push back publicly on that thing. So I think that has pretty much settled down. But one of the disturbing things that happened during our testimony before the Legislative Audit Committee is after our testimony was done, at the end of the public piece of it, when nobody was hardly in the room anymore, but while they were still on camera, one of the legislators on the audit committee said, you know, I really think we need to go to a defined contribution plan. You could see the discomfort in the faces of a lot of members of the committee because they didn't want to get into that discussion, but there still is that certain interest on the part of some legislators, I think, to get away from the defined benefit pension plan like we have and move to something where more of the responsibility and the risk is borne by employees. So we didn't see a groundswell of support for that. It kind of came from one edge of the committee. It's something we're keeping our eye on, though, because we know it's out there. Another issue that has been in the press lately, at least the Milwaukee press, is the status of the Milwaukee County pension system. Their system is small. They have about $2 billion in assets. They're about 75% funded, I think. But the most recent issue has had to do with their ability to actually administer their very, very complex benefits. Fraught with errors, they have been overpaying, they have been underpaying. When they overpay, they don't seem to like to get the money back from people. When they underpay, they pay it out with interest. There's a lot of stuff going on there. The county executive and members of the county board have expressed a desire, I think, to wash their hands of the issue and wondered if we would like to take over. I don't know if we need to talk about that anymore. We have been open to discussing things with them, but I've made it very clear, we're not putting the WRS at risk. We're not putting taxpayers and members at risk by taking on Milwaukee County. Milwaukee County needs to be responsible for their own liabilities, their own payments. If they come into the WRS, they're just like every other employer that comes in, nothing special. They pay their contributions on time, their employees pay their contributions. They don't get to decide each year how much they're going to pay or whether they're going to pay. Secondly, I'm really not interested in administering their benefits, which they don't seem to be able to administer with any degree of skill because it's very complicated. So making sure if they were to come in, that they're coming in under WRS benefits, I think is critical as well. So at this point, we've had kind of some high-level discussions with them. They're kind of feeling out and just trying to get a sense of if they were to, say, enroll all their new employees in the WRS, or just all of their current employees get future service in the WRS, what would that mean for them? They're really in the exploratory phase. They're also working pretty hard to get their administrative issues under control. They're doing another big audit, trying to find all the things that need fixing there. So keep your eye on this. You know, I would prefer to see a defined benefit pension plan continue to exist and find a way to help them do that rather than to see them go out of business entirely. So that's why I'm approaching the table, at least being willing to talk and listen to what they have in mind. And then finally, on the legislative front, there are a couple of things I just wanted to highlight real quickly. And I guess I will spend time on those middle two bullets. Those are the bills that Senator Dewey Strobel has been talking about for quite some time. One of them would increase the minimum retirement age by either 2 or 5 years, depending on what category you're in. So going, like for protectives, for police and fire, going from 50 to 52 for a minimum retirement age, and for general employees and teachers going from 55 to either 57 or 60, depending on which version of the bill he's talking about. And then the other one would increase the final average earnings that we use to calculate a benefit from 3 years to 5 years. So instead of your 3 highest years, it would go to your 5 highest years. When he started talking about these bills, he applied them to current employees. And one would kick in 5 years from the date it went into effect, and the other one would apply to people who are under 40. We had some real issues with the effects of that on current employees, and had a discussion with him about those things. I think other legislators felt the same way. Anyway, make a long story short, yesterday he finally got around to introducing his legislation. It's Senate Bill 190, or 190 or 290, I think. What he did is he combined both of those ideas into one bill. He applies them to only new hires who come in after the effective date of the bill. And the increase in the minimum retirement age for general employees and teachers would be 60 rather than 55. So we went up 5 years on that. So those have been introduced, been referred to committee. I think there's probably about 8 or 10 legislators that signed on for that. So it's not, doesn't have huge support, but I think at some point, we have seen these changes in lots of other states. So they're not like earth-shattering or news-creating for us anyway. So we'll keep our eye on that. At the federal level, I just wanted to mention one thing that's going on as everybody talks about tax reform. One of the things that we are seeing starting to bubble up is proposals to, again, on the federal level, treat contributions to retirement plans on a post-tax basis. Right now, when you contribute, you pay your contributions to the WRS, it's pre-tax. When you make contributions to a supplemental 403B or 457 plan, it's pre-tax so that you get a tax advantage for doing that. You're taxed when you take it out, but you're not taxed when you put it in. 401k plans in the private sector, same sort of thing. In their effort to find revenue enhancers to pay for other priorities, they are seriously now talking about making those contributions post-tax, like Roth IRAs, where You take the contributions on an after-tax basis. When you take the money out when you retire, you don't pay tax on it. But that, I think, has some major implications for retirement security and retirement savings for most Americans. So we're keeping an eye on that. So wrapping up here, just a couple of things that we're doing at ETF. The little image on the left is basically a graphic of our current IT systems. We have about 17 different IT systems that we are converting to one IT system so that we have all the information in one place so that we can do more efficiently to serve our members. History seems to be that every time they added a new benefit program for us to administer, we would create a new IT system to administer it with, and they didn't talk to each other and data issues all over the place. That project is coming along very well. We have our second major phase that will be introduced on January 1st of 2018, where employers will start reporting their employees and contributions to us in that system. And then 2 years after that, we will be opening up a new portal for employees and members, retirees, to be able to go in, log into a secure site, be able to download your pension statements, your tax forms, all that sort of thing. We are getting more and more requests for that sort of service coming from people. So we'll be able to do that hopefully in the future. And then finally, on the disability side, we are taking some initiatives. We currently have 5 disability programs. We have a short-term disability program and 4 long-term disability programs. Why? I don't know. We don't think that makes a lot of sense. Some of them are struggling financially right now because people, as they pay more for their health insurance, are dropping their disability coverage, what we are hearing anecdotally anyway. So we have a major redesign underway of those disability programs. The idea is to hold members and employers harmless, but consolidate those different programs into one streamlined, easier to understand set of disability programs. So, no questions yet, but you can stay connected with ETF. So I'm ready to turn it over to Michael and look forward to coming back in half an hour or so and answering some questions for you.
Good morning. Can you hear me okay? So before I get into my presentation, I just had a couple of personal reflections. One is, I was riding out here this morning and stuff's starting to put out. You know, I noticed the leaves are coming out and we're seeing some tulips and some daffodils. And I was reminded in 1979 when they flew me up here to interview for a job in the state budget office. I came in the second week of May and it was spectacular. The trees were out. They put me up at the inn on the park. I walked down State Street. It was just beautiful. And I remember calling back home and saying, this place is wonderful, you know, to my future wife. And I said, this would be a great place for us to move to. I didn't realize the leaves had been out 2 weeks. You know, the dogwoods had already come and gone. The red buds had gone in North Carolina. The daffodils, the azaleas were getting ready to bloom, and here it was, the leaves had just come out up here. So that was one observation, and that was 37 years ago when I had that little trip. And the second thing that I was reflecting on is that as a Southerner, I bought a corner lot. And didn't realize what I had done until the first winter. And I realized that it wasn't just a lot, it was a lot and a half, and there was 270 linear feet of sidewalk, almost the length of a football field. I lived in that house 14 years and never owned a snowblower because we didn't have a garage or a basement that you could get down into unless you carried it. So that was another reflection that I had about learning. And the other one, I just take a moment of personal privilege to tell you that, and I think only my buddy Steve Bourne and maybe Bob knows this, but I'm getting married. I've been divorced for about 7 years, and I'm getting married this fall in September. Thank you. You know, a second marriage is evidence of hope over experience. But I was reminded of a little story about, and this time I'm marrying a Wisconsin woman. I married a Southern woman last time, and that was a great marriage for, 28 years we were married. Have two great children as a result of it, but, things went separate way. But this time I'm going to marry a Wisconsin woman, and I was reminded of this story about these three friends, all bachelors, and they were getting married. And one of them married a woman from North Carolina, which is my home state, as I think most of you know. And so he said, well, I'm going to set the rules up here. So after the wedding, he said, here's the thing. My expectation is that when I come home, that the dishes are washed and put away, and that supper, that the house is clean. So the first day he came home, I didn't notice too much. And the second day, things looked a little bit. But the third day, that place was picked up, and the house was clean. The dishes were washed and put away. So he was pretty happy. Well, his buddy married a woman from South Dakota. And so he said, well, I can do a little better than that. So he told her that he wanted the dishes done, he wanted the house clean, but he wanted a good hot meal on the table when he came home. Well, the first day, it wasn't too much. She wasn't too happy with that. And the second day, it didn't look like it was going to. But the third day, he came home, and sure enough, house was clean, dishes put away, and there was a spectacular meal waiting on him on the table. Well, the third fella, he was marrying a woman from Wisconsin. And he decided, well, I can do better than these two guys. So he told her all three of those things. But he said, in addition to that, I want you to do the laundry, and I don't like mowing the yard, so I want you to mow the yard too. So the first day he couldn't see much. The second day he couldn't see much, but by the third day the swelling had gone down in his left eye. And his arm had healed enough to where he could make himself a sandwich and load the dishwasher. But he still has trouble when he pees. So what I take from that story is I'm not putting any expectations out there on this marriage going to this Wisconsin woman. But I'm excited about it, and I'm looking forward to it, and hopefully, Lord willing, and the creek don't rise, it'll happen in September. So I want to talk with you about four things today. And Bob and I, you'll see parallels. We didn't coordinate this. I've never seen his presentation until 35 minutes ago. But you'll see parallels between the two because we are in the same business. We work on the investments for the Wisconsin retirement system, and Bob and his offices do the administration of that. But we are a team working together, and we coordinate really quite well. I want to talk to you first and foremost about what we're doing to protect and grow the WRS for a strong future. So that's my theme today, and that's what I'm going to spend most of my time on. We're going to talk also about our strategy and how it's designed to weather downturns as well as generate solid returns, and why we have the strategy in place that we have today post-2008. Third, I want to talk to you about how we're controlling costs and continue to do that. And then I got a couple slides in there just to talk a little bit about the future. Bob and I had presentations at the Board of Trustees meeting on Wednesday, and we had a PhD in there who talked about people who try to make financial predictions. And the bottom line is, he says, they're all wrong. And there's just no correlation between the predictions and what actually happens. But there's some things going on. I'll comment a little bit about that today. This is kind of an overview slide. You know some of the same stuff. There was 600,000 members, 1,400 employers, and we do the investing for that. Bob, I make the money, Bob spends the money. That's the way this works. We manage $96 billion. It's up to the total now. This was as of the end of 16. It was $104 billion for everything because we do the state investment fund. We manage money for local governments, but that total fund's up to $108 billion now. And as you saw already, we're the 9th largest public fund in the country. So we have some heft, which allows us to negotiate better deals. And I think, we're proud of the work that we've done to protect the system. And I think most of you know that Wisconsin has a model system. You heard Bob talk about some of it. And so, and Bob and I get harassed regularly when we go to national meetings with our peers. Because, and I'll show you some numbers on their funding status in a minute, but they're quite envious of the situation that we're in. Bob also talked with you about the returns. I'll put it in a little larger context, the 8.6. And you know, we compare to a benchmark. We don't set the benchmark. Our trustees do that working with an outside consultant. And a benchmark is just a way to compare how our return is relative to comparable investments out in the market. It's kind of the yardstick that we get measured by. So how we know how well we're doing, how our trustees know how well we're doing, and how you know we're doing compared to comparable investments out in the market. So you can see here that we beat that benchmark on the 1 year, we beat it on the 5 year, we beat it on the 10 year, and we beat it on the 20 year. And you saw Bob's figure earlier about the 7.2% that was there. And so the 5 year's been good, the 10 year's down a little bit to 5.2, but you know that's because it includes 2008. And that was a big hole to dig out of, and we're continuing to work on that and move that forward. If you happen to be in the variable fund, we saw you see a return of 10.6% for that last year, but here once again you can see we beat the benchmark in all of the categories, the 1 year, the 5 year, the 10 year, and the 20 year. But now what you might notice that's interesting is the core fund, 20 year, 7.2, the variable 20-year, 7.1. So for all that angst that you folks have for being in the variable, I know you still need a little excitement in your life. Well, the variable fund provides it for you. But the bottom line, it comes out about the same. And that's the power of diversification. You know, the variable fund is all stocks, 70% U.S., 30% international. So it tends to be more volatile. Those of you in 2008 know you lost 40%. You know, the core fund went down 26. But if you live 20 years, it comes out to be about the same. So that's the good news. So a couple of things about what we're attempting to do. You know, we considered the design of the WRS when we put together our investment strategy. And as you know, our annuitants don't have an automatic cost of living adjustment. When we make money, you get money, and when we don't do as well, that money comes back. We've never really clawed back money except for 5 years, and that was after the 2008. You can never go below your initial benefit payment. But the dividends that get paid out to you, you share that investment risk, and so some of those can come back, and I'm sure a number of you actually experienced that and saw that happen. You know, but the good news is that the 5-year adjustment, if you look at what it's been equal to inflation. So it's been about 1.4 we've had 4 consecutive years of increases. It's been about 1.4% per year, and that's exactly the same as inflation has been over the last 5 years, is 1.4. So these dividend adjustments are intended to help hold you harmless to the effects of inflation, similar to what a cost of living adjustment does. But if you look over the 20-year, what you see is that the adjustments were greater than inflation. So they were about 2.6% per year versus an inflation rate of 2.1 at the CPI. But Bob laid it out pretty clearly. We're in a low return environment. And part of that reason is because the Fed has suppressed the return on interest rates. You may remember last year I showed a couple of slides about the decades of the 90s and then the 2000s and then the last 10 years where we are. You know, cash used to pay out 6-7%. I'm old enough to remember when you had money in a passbook savings account, you got 5%, and you thought you were getting robbed. You'd be happy to get 5% now on your cash, wouldn't you? But that has come down and it's made it increasingly harder. David Villa, our chief investment officer, says the Fed's been stealing from us. I try to keep him from quoting that in the paper. And by the way, I will say that, you know, I'm happy. I told Bob and his staff that I'm happy for them to tweet We don't have a tweeting account. We leave that to the president. But we don't do tweeting at SWIB, but I know there's a lot of people out there, but we're just not there yet. But I'm happy for Nancy to be tweeting and do that, and we do follow some. So let me talk a little bit about, if you saw the previous slide, you saw that the core fund's 20-year return was 7.2%. It's equal to the assumed rate. But as Bob said, we can't really count on that occurring every year for the next few years. We've been doing really well, and I and others refer to what's going on in the stock market as the Trump bump. You know, a lot of people thought the market would go down. It actually has done the opposite. Again, go back to the prediction piece. But how long that'll last, we don't know. But we know what goes up does eventually come down, and we believe that'll be the case. But it is for the last 20 years, we're right at that 7.2. And we believe that we'll make our forecasts are 7.3, 7.4 over the next 20, 30 years. But it doesn't mean the next couple of years that we'll be there, because it's a pretty frothy market out there right now. So one of the reasons we can implement the strategies that we can is because the WRS is well funded. You saw Bob's chart up there of 100%. You saw the GASB at 98.2. It's the envy of many systems. And it's because we also have a lower assumed rate of 7.2. Now, there's people out there arguing that 7.2 is too high and it should come down. And we did go down from 7.8 down to 7.2. You saw that on Bob's chart where that drop occurred a few years ago. But compared to our peers, we're still quite conservative, and I'll show you some numbers on that. I'm going to start off by talking about peer funding ratios. Now, I got this list of systems from the Legislative Audit Bureau. And as you might suspect, like Bob, we spend a lot of time with the Legislative Audit Bureau. That's part of the agreement we have with the legislature is that they can come in and audit us, and they do every year on our financials and every 2 years on a management audit. And that helps ensure the integrity that we're managing the money well, both for legislators and for the members in the system and the public at large. And so there were no findings in this report that we had back, came out in December, about the same time that Bob's did. In fact, Bob and I had our Legislative Audit Committee hearing at the same time in January, so we were both over there. They did the management audit based upon performance in 2015. Some of you might have seen the press that came out on that. But in the study, the LAB confirmed that the WRS is one of the best funded public pension plans, sitting at 100%, but we knew that. And what you might not know is how well funded the other funds in the peer group are. So we did a bit of research, and this is what we came up with. The next closest fund is funded at 86.5%. And you heard Bob talking about some of that. And the national, they've done at the national average is about 76.2. Now that's not catastrophic. Like Bob said, if you got 80% of your mortgage, then you're pretty happy that you're funded at that level. These are long term. But it puts us in a different position in terms of how we invest our money. So why is Wisconsin so much higher? It's a couple of reasons. First, WRS is well funded because employers and employees make their contributions here. It's the Wisconsin way, unlike our unnamed neighbor to the south. And Bob referenced them as well. But they make their contributions here, and so that's one of the main reasons. Another one is that we have reasonable benefits. They're solid, but they're not peaked. They're not at the highest in the country. So if those of you talk to retirees in other states, you know that some of those during the 90s when assets were running up, a number of the legislatures increased benefits. And then 2001, 2002 hit. The asset value dropped, but the liabilities kept going up. And that's really affected their funding ratio. Third one is because of the plan design, where you share some of the investment risk along with the employers. And so that helps balance out and keep us well funded. And then the fourth one is the fact that most of the money that we have good returns from SWIB over the decades in the past. And Bob referenced the figure 73, 74%. Of the money that's in the WRS came from return on investments. It didn't come from employee or employer contributions. It came from return on investments. So let's take a look at the other category, which is the peer assumed rates of return. I know there's a lot, there's a lot on this slide, may be hard to read either in front of you or up here. But our return rate, expects us to make the 7.2 over 30 years. So why is that important? A well-funded system and a reasonable assumed rate of return have allowed us to put in place a mix of investments that's more robust than many plans, which makes us more resilient to a greater number of market environments. And having a well-funded pension system means we do not have to take unnecessary investment risks with the trust funds. Instead, we can put together a diversified strategy of investments that allows us to meet one of the standards of responsibility that's outlined in the state statutes. And I've included an excerpt from the statutes which says that we should diversify investments in order to minimize the risk of large losses, unless under the circumstances it's clearly prudent not to do so. I think there's a couple of double negatives in there for those of you who are, work on grammar. But the idea is here we should diversify to prevent large losses. And that's the strategy we've put in place. And I want to talk with you a little bit about that. You can see on this slide the diversification that I'm talking about. We're in public fixed income, we're in stocks, we're in real estate, we're in multi-asset. We even have some inflation sensitive. Inflation is starting to go up. If you look at the unemployment numbers as they come down, it gets harder to find workers in the workforce. That means you're going to have to pay people more money. You're going to see inflation. But we've been really pretty fortunate to have a low inflationary period for the last several years. But I think we're going to start to see that inch up. So I want to circle back to the audit that I talked about, which looked at our performance in 2015. Now, they also did an audit in 2013. And at that time, they have us compared to this peer group of other public plans, and we were the second from the top. Then in 2015, we're the second from the bottom. Let me just tell you, it's a lot easier to go before the audit committee when you're second from the top. It's just a much more comfortable seat to be sitting in. So what happened? Did SWIB let its guard down? Did we get beat by the investment staff and those other funds? No, not really. What we did is it has to go back to the investment strategy that you put in place. And the recent combination of strong equity returns, which are the stock market, and low volatility, which means the change that goes up and down, we don't believe that that's sustainable going forward. And that's why we remain focused on a strategy to protect the trust funds and our members from poorly performing and volatile market environments over the long term. So sure, the markets have been strong lately, but we don't believe they're going to hold. And because of the strong funding status and our lower assumed rate of return, we do not have to swing for the fences like many of our peers. So therefore, we reduced our investments in the stock market, which accounts for over 80% of our risk. Many people don't realize that, but 80% of our risk comes from the stock market. In other words, we take a more conservative approach to the mix of investments that we select. And because of the differences in asset allocation between us and our peers, there will be times when our returns will trail some of those peers. And you may actually see that this year with the stock market going on. We've reduced our exposure to the stock market. The stock market's done really well. Our returns are not going to be as good as those. But as I said, we do not think that's going to hold, and we think there will be a correction. And when that goes down, we will not go as far down as our peers. We do not go as high, but we will not go as far. That's what having a well-funded system and a lower assumed rate of return allows us to be able to do. So why is that important? Are we being too conservative? And so I've mentioned our peers a couple times, but I want to talk to you about a different kind of peer to help make my point about the investment strategy. So this is a postcard of what used to be my dad's fishing pier on the coast of North Carolina. It went 1,025 feet out into the ocean. It was built on telephone poles, pilings. My dad used to charge people $1.25 to fish 24 hours. And back on the shore, he had a tackle shop, he had a restaurant, he had a dining room, he had a lounge, he had an oyster bar, he had an arcade, he had a trailer park, and he had a campground. So it was a big operation. And at the beach in the 50s and the 60s, this was the social hubs. So people came, you know, sometimes the men would fish and the women would take the children and go to the beach. Sometimes the women would fish and the men would take the children and go to the beach. But these were Eastern North Carolinians who couldn't afford a house at the beach. Some of them had mobile homes and trailers, and you'll see some of them in the back there. But they would come, they worked in the textile mills, they worked in the peanut farms, they worked in the Eastern North Carolina, and this was their holiday. They'd come to the beach. And they hung out in the piers. So my dad decided in about 1966 that he was going to raise some money with stockholders, and they were going to build this pier. Because there was pretty good money in the fishing business, particularly in the spring. Some of you may know, fish migrate just like birds. And so in the spring, they're down in the warmer waters, and they come north. They do that lovely thing that generates small fish in the north. They live up there all summer, and then in the fall, they come back. And there are massive runs of fish. They used to be more massive than they are now. But that pier would be lined elbow to elbow with people, coolers full of fish behind them in the spring and the fall. They'd be fishing on the south side in the spring and the north side in the fall because the fish are swimming back south. And they would catch coolers of fish, freeze them, take them home, clean them, take them home. So the pier business was pretty good. So, but you know, if you're going to make that kind of investment, you need to protect it. Now, why do you think you'd be concerned about a fishing pier that's stuck 1,000 feet out in the ocean in North Carolina? You have tornadoes up here. They got hurricanes down there, right? So, you know, the question is, what are you going to do to protect your investment? And particularly when North Carolina kind of hangs out there. You know, it comes through Cuba and the Bahamas and Bermuda, and it comes right up the coast of Florida, and the furthest part sticking out is southeast North Carolina, where we lived. So you think, well, now what am I going to do about that? You figure, well, you could put your investment in there, spend all the money, and pray that the storms go up the Gulf of Mexico. And that happens sometimes. You know, Katrina's an example of that. Sometimes it goes across Florida, but a lot of times it comes right in there along that coast and steers up there. So if you're going to think, well, one thing would be maybe to get some insurance. So you can buy some insurance. Well, if you're going to do that, you need to gather a little data to figure out what is, you know. So what happened, how frequent are hurricanes? So I did a little research. From 1950 to 1979, there were a total of 79 tropical or subtropical cyclones or hurricanes that affected North Carolina. So from 1950 to 1979, that's 29 years, involving 37 fatalities and $3 billion in damage. Okay, and the strongest hurricane during that period of time was one by the name of Hazel. All right, it came in 1954. I was born in 1953. Now, those of you who do your math can figure out real quick, I'm 63 years old. So, but I was born in 53. Hurricane Hazel hit in 1954. And we had a little family experience with Hurricane Hazel. This is our house on the ocean front after Hazel. And if you look right over here, you can see the roof of the house laying right there. And if you look over here, this is my mother in her newly remodeled kitchen and living room with a new skylight. And if you look right here, is my playpen. Okay, so it ripped the roof off the house, filled it full of sand, salt water, and rain. Now, we weren't there. We had evacuated. So it was a pretty violent storm. So we knew what those storms could do, so my dad went and took insurance out on the pier. And not only did he get insurance, but he got insurance with Lloyd's of London. Okay, it's expensive, but you're planning for the worst. So what happened was, over the next 30 plus years, the pier got knocked down 3 times. So part of the fishing pier itself would get knocked down by the waves, or a piece of another pier down the beach, a mile down the beach, would wash down and take out a section in the middle of the pier, so you'd have the end, and then you'd have the beginning. There'd be nothing in the middle. But we had insurance. You know, it was just the bumps in the road. You knew that was going to happen, and we just rebuilt. Every year when that happened, we'd rebuild, open again in the fall, sell more tickets. That was before Hurricane Floyd came to North Carolina. So this is what Hurricane Floyd looked like 10 hours before the strongest winds hit the coast where we lived. What followed was the worst modern disaster in the state's history. We lost everything. The pier house, the restaurant, the dining room, the arcade, the lounge, the campground. The septic tanks were filled with sand and water. It was a complete loss. But we had planned for the worst, and we had insurance. Now, I was chairman of the board at the time. This was a small group of stockholders, and most of them were older. I was the youngest guy that owned stock at the time, and they decided they'd had enough of the fish and pier business. They were most of them retired. They decided there'd be an opportunity to get their money out. I said, no, we ought to stay. We don't have to go back with the pier, but we ought to hold it. They're not making any more oceanfront property in North Carolina. And we owned from right here all the way down to here, all the way back to the Intercoastal Waterway. Now, you can't do much with this back here unless you're crabbing, you know, but we owned a big chunk, probably the biggest single piece of property on the coast of North Carolina, but they said, no, we're done. We cut it into 10 lots. We sold them for $199,000 a piece. We took our insurance money and we walked away. 2 years later, those same lots sold for $600,000. So, you know, prediction, you know, back into prediction, but you know, where you stand is where you sit. They wanted their money, but we got out. But the point is, we had the insurance money. We could have rebuilt the whole thing. So now, why do I tell you that story? It's not so you can get meteorologically knowledgeable about the coast of North Carolina. It's because I think there's strong parallels between buying insurance for the fishing pier and how we're managing the assets for the WRS. Number one, the pier was there 30 years. The WRS has been around 33 years. And we've built an investment strategy that generates returns even in the face of market ups and downs. So we have ups and downs. You know, the year before last, we had a minus 40 basis points, 0.4%. So you go up and down, but we recover. We come through that. Last year was 8.6. But in addition to that, we've designed a strategy that if another 2008 hits, if a financial Floyd hits the country again, we will not go down as deep. It's not that we won't go down, but we won't go as deep. We won't lose everything that we've invested in. Some of these other systems that are going to have higher returns, they're going to take much bigger dips when that occurs. So, and we believe we owe it to the members not to bet that another big storm will not happen. So because of our strong funding status and our relatively low assumed rate of return, we don't have to. So we don't have to take this risk. So back to the audit I mentioned earlier. Was our performance lower than our peers in 2015? Yeah. But were we back in the top quartile last year in 2016? You bet we were. And what is the right investment strategy in these times? You know, I don't know. You've heard me say before, if I could predict the future, I wouldn't be working for the state. But I can't. However, I do believe that we have the right system for this time and our members, and we have a viable investment strategy to protect it. Historically, SWIB's strategy has contributed to a secure future for the WRS, and I believe we're positioned to do the same thing in the future. So over the last 20 years, the investments we've made have generated $42 billion over what you would get if you had a 60-40 stock mix, stock bond mix. You know, that's a kind of a comparison they do in the industry. Well, what if you just put 60% in stocks, 40%? We've generated $42 billion more than that. And as I mentioned earlier, in just the last 10 years, our returns account for almost 74% of the total income. But as important as it is to have a strong investment strategy, it's equally important to manage costs, because every dollar we save in costs is just as good as the dollar we make in return. And one way we control costs and manage risk is by doing the investment work in-house. Now, this chart shows you what's happened with our internal and external investments. So in 2007, you can see right here, we were managing 21% of the money in-house, and that has steadily gone up to we're at about 64%. And the external management was 79, and it's gone down to 36. Now, why is that important? Because we can manage that money for a fifth of what it costs for us to pay outside managers to do that. And that makes sense. So, but in order to do that, we have to build the infrastructure to the man. When you hire somebody else to manage the money, they've got to have the infrastructure, they've got to have the staff. So what we've done is we've actually expanded our infrastructure, and that same audit said, well, you know, your budget's gone up and the number of people you've hired. You know, there was somebody famous once said, you know, they know everything about cost, but they don't know anything about value. And I've been working around this legislature since 1979. It's different people now than it was then, but there's a fixation on how much did it cost, how did your positions go up. And what I said to the audit committee, you have to understand the value. And if I can do it for a fifth of what it costs to hire, but they don't care if we spend money externally, they just want to see what your operating budget is, and they want to see how many positions you've added. But I can demonstrate to them that we've actually saved money on doing that. And in fact, if you look here, you can see that as compared to some of our same peers, we manage more money in-house than many of them do. But they're coming to the same conclusion. They're 5, 10 years behind us, but they're starting to do the same thing now, which is basically build their own staffs, get a permission from their legislators to build put additional resources to work in order to take advantage of these savings. So on average, 62% of our assets are managed internally. I mentioned that to you, and we do that for 22% of the total cost. Our total budget's about $250 million. Our operating budget's about $52 million, what we have at SWIB inside. But our total, but 22% of the money manages 62%. And the 38% that's managed externally, we pay 78% of our budget goes to that. Now you'd say, well, why don't you just bring it all inside? But that would take significantly more assets to manage, to build our own hedge fund staff, to build our own real estate staff, to build our own private equity expertise. So in some cases, we need the diversification. We just think it's not wise to spend the money. I'll give you an example. I was at a meeting last year with a Canadian pension plan, kind of like Social Security. They manage about $200 billion. We're running about $100 billion. We got 170 staff. They got 1,000. But they do everything. They got international offices in Hong Kong and in London. They find, you know, they set their own, they own airlines. We're not playing on that scale. That's the Canadian model. But, so we leverage it where we think it makes sense. So CEM, which is an external benchmarking company that the trustees hire to come in to compare our costs, they show that in the 2015 report, our total costs were second lowest in our peer group of 15 large pension plans. So we work to optimize the costs incurred in order to manage the assets. And internal management has clearly benefited us. And so we're saving about $75 million per year compared to the similar funds who pay to manage those same assets because our staff manages them, a majority of the assets at a much lower cost. And in fiscal year 2017, our operating budget is $53.5 million. Over the last 10 years, we've saved $344 million compared to other funds, and it's in large part because our transition is away from those external managers. Our cost savings are possible because we hire experienced, savvy investors and qualified professionals to manage these funds. So the plan we put in place is a true pay for performance. We got rid of across-the-board pay increases. It focuses on long-term results that are heavily weighted towards the 5-year returns, just like the dividend process that calculates your dividends is on a 5-year basis. 15% of our incentive compensation plan is based on 1-year performance. 85% is based upon 5-year performance. So we're looking for long-term demonstration of success. Our trustees this week just approved the incentive compensation plan for the investment performance over the past 5 years. You'll see a story in the State Journal about it tomorrow. I can guarantee it, because we're going to release the press release. We used to wait until they come calling. I just said, well, screw this. Let's just go ahead. We just put it out. So we'll put it out tomorrow. You pick up the State Journal, you'll get to see what I'm going to make this year. You know, it's one of the things that you deal with when the public sector is, you know, everybody knows, but I'm fairly confident they'll have the top 5 earners, and there'll be some significant pieces. When the top one will be our CIO, our Chief Investment Officer. He just got another international award this year for the investment strategies he's put in place. And I couldn't be prouder to be working with him or happier to see him make that money. His total take home this year will probably be about $1 million. But I know that he could make $5 million working somewhere else. He and I went to a private equity firm in San Francisco, and I said, well, how do you compensate your people? He goes, well, if I have an analyst, portfolio manager, and they generate $75 million of return for me, I don't have a bit of a problem paying them $20 million. I said, I'm sorry, what did you say? He says, if they make $75 million for me, I don't have a problem paying them $20 million. I said, yeah, we could do that one time, and then we'd have to leave the state. But that one time would be big. But we'd have to get out of Dodge, there's no doubt. But, so and I was just talking to retirees yesterday in Stratford. Do you know where Stratford is? No, neither did I. But it's a little southwest of Wausau. So, and it's flat. And there was a crossroads and a big bar. And I spoke in a bar and a restaurant in there, and they had a bunch of retirees. And you know, when the average retiree paycheck is $24,800, and the average state employee makes $45,000, 6-digit incentive compensation payments are big. And I understand it. That's a lot of money in Wisconsin. But I don't play in Wisconsin. I play at the national level. And I don't set the rules for the game. I just have to play in the game. And in order for me to attract this type of staff that I need, and let me just tell you, Madison's not the easiest place to hire investment staff. When you're in New York or Boston or San Francisco and you're looking, you're in investment world and you're looking to change jobs, you don't look at the want ads in Madison right off the bat. But it's also not the hardest place to recruit. And what I've learned in the 5 years that I've been doing this is that we have good compensation, we have as challenging investment strategies as they can do on either coast, and I don't have to match those salaries. I just got to go at the median of banks and insurance companies, because that's where I draw from a lot. And the secret sauce is they got some connection to Wisconsin. They're born here. They went to school here. They're married to somebody who's from here, and they understand quality of life, other than January to March. Okay? You don't want to recruit in January to March if you can help it. But they understand quality of life, and I am able to attract and retain those people in our workforce, and they are generating results for us. So that team, over the last 5 years, has generated $1.2 billion above what the market. If you'd put your money in the market, that team's generated $1.2 billion more than what you would have gotten in the market. And that's quite frankly what you pay us to do. And that's what we pay them to do. So looking forward, I got a couple of things in here I'll just touch on real. You know, stock prices have hit all-time highs. They're back down a little bit now, but earlier this year, there's been strong equity returns and low volatility. So it's just not been jumping around as much as people would have predicted. I don't believe that's going to hold. We're going to see a correction, but when, I don't know. The Eurozone and Japan have started to settle down. You know, they're looking much more positive than they have in the past, and disposable income in this country is now the highest on record. People have once again rebuilt their savings after 2008. However, here's another side. U.S. productivity in the fourth quarter was the worst we've had in 5 years. So I'm not sure that this optimism that we're seeing in the market is built on the real fundamentals. There are some things that's working. The economy's added more jobs. You know, business has been sitting on a big stockpile of cash during this great recession we've had. They've been scared to spend. They're starting to spend. 235,000 jobs in February alone. So now they're starting to spend, they're starting to generate. That's going to put some pressure on the hiring market and on the workforce. You're going to see wages go up. Labor costs in 16 rose the fastest in 9 years. Markets will remain challenging. I think we can achieve that 7.2 over the long term, and the WRS will remain financially strong. So that's my presentation. I think, Millard, one of you want to take a little break and then have them come back, and then Bob will answer the hard questions and I'll take the easy ones. So how long do you want them to be gone? So we're going to give you 10 minutes and then come back for 20 minutes of questions and answers, and we'll see you in 10 minutes.